This is the blog, Theo Fantastique, and for better or worse, I'm John Moorhead, the guy who puts it all together and promotes all things fantastic and horrific as it relates to the world of religion and spirituality. And I'm privileged today to have a return guest, Steve Wiggins, who's also a collaborator. We've worked together on a number of projects, and I also consider him a friend in all things fantastic. Steve, welcome back to the website and the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, you have got a new book out. This is, what is it, the 50th anniversary for the Wicker Man?
That's right. Yeah, I'll hold it up here so people can see it.
Yeah, there we go. That great film. And with that anniversary, you've got a new book out, as you just shown, appropriately titled The Wicker Man. Before we unpack that book a little bit, I'm sure most people who are going to be watching this know what the film is about. But for those who don't, who've been living under a rock for 50 years, can you summarize the basic plot of The Wicker Man?
Sure. It's actually quite controversial in some areas because people will say it's not a horror film, but you could very easily watch it and not think it's a horror film until the last 5 minutes. But when it becomes a horror film, it becomes clear that it's a horror film throughout. So basically, the story is of a setup. A police sergeant who is in Scotland is sent an anonymous note about a missing child on a remote Scottish island. The note, of course, as we learn as the film unfolds, is a ruse to get him to come to the island. So he flies out by himself on a seaplane, lands on the island, tries to find the child, and everybody claims they don't know who this child is. And then he finally gets people to admit it, but then they kind of intimate that she's dead and nobody knows how she died. And so as he starts to investigate this, he becomes convinced that she is alive and that she is going to be sacrificed to the pagan gods of Summerisle, the name of the island. Because the people on Summerisle are pagan. They live according to Celtic mythology, and they have their own set of gods. And this really sets off the tension. The tension for the movie is very much religion versus religion. So what we've got here is a Christian police sergeant who's come to an island that's inhabited by pagan Scots, and he wants to not only rescue the girl, but he also wants to set their religion right. And so it really is kind of a wonderful little interchange between those people who have different worldviews. So as the movie unfolds, he realizes that the girl is alive. He thinks they're going to sacrifice her on May Day. So this is a film that takes place in May. Ironically, it was shot in November and in December. So it doesn't quite match the setting for the story, but he feels that they're going to sacrifice her on May Day, and as he goes and rescues her, we find out, and as I say, the last 5 minutes or so, that this was all a trap set for him, and he is the sacrifice. And of course, they take him and burn him in the eponymous Wicker Man, which the movie uses for its title. So that's the basic plot, and it's wonderfully made movie, very quirky. So I would say the first time people see it, they say, "What was that?" It's just a strange movie, but it's a very powerful movie, and I was drawn to it mainly because of its the religious conversation that was going on in it, and also the fact that it was set on a holiday, which it really comes down to what you might call holiday horror, which is the angle I take in the book.
Yeah, we'll unpack that aspect, the way you decided to approach it, but just to kind of probe the film a little bit more. Given when it was shot, obviously today we still have this trope of Christianity versus paganism / Satanism that shows up a lot in horror films. What was it about the time in which The Wicker Man was filmed that they decided to pick up on that theme, but to make it so quirky? Paganism wasn't treated, in a lot of these horror films, it's really a simplistic black and white, pagan equals evil and this kind of thing, but it's a little more complex in The Wicker Man. Why do you think this dynamic came about?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, 1973, a number of things were going on. People were very concerned, for one thing, about the end of the world. That was a very live concern in the 70s. Um, it's sometimes hard for us to believe that now, but it really was. And not only that, but we also have, and that was from a Christian point of view at the end of the world, but we also have at the same time the development of a number of alternative religions that were starting to get noticed. And the Satanic Temple, or not the Satanic Temple, the Church of Satan was founded in the mid 60s, and people were becoming aware of that. There was concern about cults, as they were called at the time. Religion scholars, of course, now call them new religious movements. But there were real concerns about this deviant belief. And we'd just come off of the 60s, where in society, things were really kind of thrown up in the air in the 60s. I mean, the 50s were very staid and, if you can characterize a decade, buttoned down, very much dad goes to work and mom stays at home. And then in the 60s, all that changes, and people were feeling threatened, I think, by anything that challenged that kind of normative existence as they saw it at that time. We see similar backlashes periodically throughout history. I think during the Trump administration, we went through another one where there's a challenge to this licentious culture out there. And so I think that was probably why at this time that it was presented that way. I've watched a few interviews with Robin Hardy, who was the director, and Anthony Shaffer, who was the screenwriter for the movie. And it seems that Robin Hardy especially was really concerned about pagan groups at this time. He was concerned that this could really happen. And so he put it onto a remote Scottish island. Uh, another factor I should also mention is that there's a novel that this was very, very loosely based on that was published shortly before the movie was shot. Again, a very interesting kind of dynamic there, because those who've been interviewed about the movie really downplay the novel, but the novelist actually sued for infringement of copyright at one point, saying that this was my story. They took it and didn't credit me. So there's this kind of nexus of things that were happening at the time. I think the zeitgeist, with the sense of what was going on with the concerns about the Christian concerns about the end of the world, new religious movements, and that coming together with this novel being written that gave them the idea for the movie, it all just sort of came together at the right time. One of the real great ironies I find for horror films is that, of course, 1973 was the same year The Exorcist was released. So it's also on its 50th anniversary this year. And so those two movies, very different. The Exorcist is not quirky at all, but The Wicker Man, I think it was Robin Hardy's first movie, and I think he was still finding his way as a director. And it also ran into some problems with the production company that was responsible for funding it. They decided they didn't. It was bought out by a different company during the course of the filming, and the new company really didn't want to support this movie. So a lot of unusual things happened during the course of both the filming and the editing that made it into a rather unusual and quirky movie. Not only that, but there are actually three different versions of it there's in circulation. There's the theatrical release, which had about 14 minutes cut out of the original cut. The original cut is not it's no longer extant in its original form. The extras and the material that was cut were lost. And so if you ever see, and you can find the full version online, especially, but if you ever see it, you'll notice the rough transitions between the parts where they had to make a negative from the positive to reinsert it into the film. And it's quite clear why they did that, because the original negatives are lost. But then there was also the director's cut, which is, or sometimes called the final cut, which is different yet again. And so these three versions are in circulation. In the book, I base it on the theatrical release because that's the one that is most widely known. But because of the differences between the various versions, you'll find that if you were to take account of the story, at least from the holiday angle, from the full version, the timing is all different. And so things happen on different days. And that would, of course, affect the way that you analyze a film. So I had to pick one form of the film and stay with it. And that's what I did.
Mm. Now, there's been a lot that's been written on the Wicker Man. Um, as you were thinking about a project to do and another writing assignment, with the wealth of materials on the Wicker Man, what was your inspiration for taking this on?
That's a good question. I had originally started out by working on a book on holiday horror. And that was a couple of things happened that steered me in this direction. Holiday horror is an understudied subgenre. I wouldn't call it a genre, but it's a subgenre of the horror genre. And the basic idea behind it is it doesn't have, it's not just a movie that takes place on a holiday. It's a movie that derives its fear, its engine for what's going on in the movie from the holiday. So it can't be just, oh, it's the 4th of July and something scary happened. There's got to be a bit more depth to it than that. And so there are a lot of movies that are like this. Midsummer, which is quite often compared to The Wicker Man, is another one. Of course, it's based on Midsummer, as the title indicates. And that one of the real questions that sometimes gets asked about The Wicker Man is why it wasn't titled something about May Day if it's holiday horror. And we can talk about that later if you like. But the idea was I was working on a book about holiday movies, and I realized, for one thing, it was going to take a very long time to do it because there were a lot of movies I needed to see. I need to read a lot and do a lot more analysis than I had done before. And so I was thinking, well, this is a great idea for a book, and someday I may go back to it, but it's going to take a very long time to get it done. And I wanted to try to get something out there because my last book had been published about 3 years ago. And at about the same time, I became aware of the Devil's Advocate series from Auteur Press, which is now owned by Liverpool University Press, and started reading some of their volumes. I thought, this would make a good fit for the series. And I was surprised that the series didn't have a Wicker Man volume. And so I contacted the editor, who at that time was in charge. He's since left the press, but I contacted him and asked if he'd be interested in a Wicker Man proposal. And he said, I've had 2 or 3 already. And he said, we've turned them all down because everybody is pitching the folk angle aspect or folk horror aspect of this, because the Wicker Man is folk horror. There's no question that it is. But he said, that's been done to death. We need something different. And so I thought, okay, we've got a press that's looking for a book on the Wicker Man. I've got an approach I haven't seen used anywhere before. So why don't I combine the two? And that's what led to the book.
Fascinating. Yeah, that folk horror seems to be an area of great interest. I used to, until this year, I was a regular at the FanX Comic-Con in Salt Lake City. And 2 years in a row, I was pulled into panels on folk horror. And of course, The Wicker Man was a big part of the discussion. And Wicker Man is considered, part of the unholy trinity of folk horror. But instead of, as you've mentioned, that has been treated almost to death. So what kinds of insights were you able to discover by approaching it through the lens of holiday horror and May Day?
Yeah, it really was quite interesting. For one thing, it sets up the conflict between religions very nicely, because holidays, even secular holidays today, holidays in their origin are religious. So we might have secular holidays now, but the idea of a holiday is a religious idea. And so that was kind of one of the driving forces behind this, is to look at how religion fuels horror, which it often does. And in this case, it was quite clear that was happening with Wicker Man, and I'd not seen anybody treat it that way. As you said, I've seen many people treating it as folk horror, but nobody had done it that way. And the other aspects that we find about how these things all fit together is that the Wicker Man takes that idea of a sacred day, a holy day, and builds it up to fit the plot of the movie. So in other words, the May Day, as it's represented in the movie, never happened. It's not a real thing. Yes, people had maypoles. Yes, they had dances around maypoles, and yes, they celebrated May Day as a time of the year when nature is changing towards summer. But what they didn't do is the material that is in the movie. The no, as far as we know, no human sacrifices ever took place as part of a May Day celebration. As a matter of fact, sacrifice doesn't seem to have been part of it at all. And the kind of the intricate way that they set this up with sword dancers and beheadings, burning people in a wicker man, all the hobby horse and the teaser and the fool, all of this is very well developed, but it's not historical. There's nothing really to it. There are some historical elements to it, but I understand that the reason this came about was that Robin Hardy was reading James Frazer's The Golden Bough, and James Frazer, I think he's a fascinating character, and his book is certainly a very important one. It still is important, but his method was debunked a long time ago. No anthropologist today would take it seriously, because what he did is essentially compared things across cultures and said, this looks like that, and I think these must have a common ancestor or be related. And they gave us kind of the concept of the monomyth, which Joseph Campbell, of course, ran off with. So those ideas are really under a lot of duress these days because nobody really believes that's what's going on. But he had been reading that, and if you read The Golden Bough in the full 13-volume series, because it did balloon out to quite a big production before it was done, there are 2 volumes based on the fire cults of Europe, and one of them talks rather extensively about Wicker men, and it makes the claim that the Celts used to do this, and it says that there's very good evidence that there was human sacrifice. No, there isn't. But the idea, of course, really comes back to, or goes back to Julius Caesar. He's the only written source we have that mentions a Wicker man from that time period. And he probably got it from another writer even more ancient than himself. And he was doing it because he was disparaging the Celts. The Celts were at war with Rome. Rome was at war with the Celts. He was trying to show what barbarians they were. They build these wicker men and they put people inside and burn them to death. That's the kind of people we're up against, these Celts. And Frazer, of course, took that and said, yeah, that's what happened. Well, no, not really. So that element of looking at the holiday and figuring out what really happened on May Day, what do we know? And we don't know a lot. It takes a lot of historical sleuthing to try to piece together what we can know about historical May Day. Really intrigued me. It's like, well, why'd they choose this holiday to run a horror movie? And maybe one of the reasons, just kind of speculating, is that it's not very well known. It gives you a lot of leeway to develop your own holiday if you want to. So there's an actual holiday, May Day, but we don't know much about it. So it gave them a lot of space to sort of develop this fictional holiday and a fictional account to go with it.
Hmm. Now, I looked at the Oxford University Press website. We'll put the link up in the program notes for folks, as well as the Amazon link, and encourage folks to purchase it. But there's some description of your book, and it talks about exploring horror as a vehicle for religious tolerance. Can you say a little bit about how this works in the context of your book?
Sure. Yeah. One of the tricky things for this is that my perspective on this is very different than that of Robin Hardy. As far as I can tell from the interviews that remain, of course, all the major people who are involved in the movie are dead now, so you can't ask anybody. But Hardy really did seem to be concerned about those non-Christian religions that were starting to become known in the 70s, as we've already talked about. And so the movie isn't really about, from his point of view, about religious tolerance. But interestingly, Anthony Schaffer in the interviews with him seems to indicate that there could be a problem with the Christian side of things too, which is where I really kind of take my point of view on this, is that if you look at the movie, the religion that is really intolerant throughout is Sergeant Howie's Christianity. He can't accept the pagans. He doesn't like what they're doing. He's rude to them. He tries to demonstrate whenever he can the superiority of his own religion. And although the pagans are, going to kill him, that's not a good thing to do. But overall, they're very nice to him. They're polite. They're moral. And one of my favorite scenes is where the interview between Lord Summerisle, played by Christopher Lee, and Sergeant Howie, who's Edward Woodward. So the two of them are having a conversation, and Sergeant Howie is saying, well, I think that you've murdered somebody here because of your pagan barbarity, that sort of thing. And Lord Summerisle says, we're a deeply moral people. We don't commit murder. And a lot of critics for the film say, oh, he's lying. He's lying through his teeth. I don't think he is. I think that if you look at the movie in its context and allow the pagans to have their say, they are the moral party in this story. So you've got this outsider who, yes, is brought there on false pretenses, but his goal is to tear apart their religion. They're not trying to tear apart his religion. They're not trying to change the way he believes. They're simply trying to fill the dictates of their own religion. So that kind of dynamic is pretty rare in horror. I mean, it's some pretty sophisticated thinking, and I'd give most of the credit to for that to the screenwriter, because I don't think Hardy was really kind of looking for that. I think it was the script that really kind of bore that subtext along and made for very interesting and discussion worthy treatment, I think. And there's a chapter in the book about the theology of Mayday, so where I delve a bit more into the kinds of ideas that are clashing here. So that's kind of the religious aspect that I was looking at, in addition to the holiday itself.
Yeah, that's my favorite scene in the film too. Where I'm trying to remember where Christopher Lee's character is saying, that there are very religious people, and the inspector says, religious, with castle with churches in ruins and children dancing naked, and he's just appalled by all of this. And Christopher Lee goes over and played. There's a shot of children dancing running and jumping over the fire, and he says they do love their divinity lesson. And I think later as that scene develops, isn't that the scene where the police inspector is making the case for Christianity being torn down on their island? And Christopher Lee pushes back and says, well, that your God had his chance or something like that. Isn't there that a part of that scene?
Yes, he had his chance and he blew it. In the
Yes.
parlance of the day, blew it. Yes. Yeah, that scene is just so terribly rich. I mean, it is a wonderful uh, exploration of the way that people who have different viewpoints come together, and whether they can be tolerant or intolerant of each other. And it really does play itself out quite well that way. And to say, with the jury out, I would say that the pagans are far more tolerant than the Christians in this particular scenario, the way it's played out here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a related question also from the description on the website about your book, and this is kind of related to what we just talked about. In relation to horror and theology and the role of cinema in understanding religious conflict. How does not only this film, but also horror in other instances help us unpack that? This is an area that is the heartbeat for Theophantastique, is looking at this. So could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that really what it comes down to with not just the Wicker Man, but religion and horror, is that they both work. And I've been trying to figure out a way to articulate this in a nice, succinct way, and I haven't yet come up with it. But they both work in similar areas of the human psyche. So there's fear involved in both. Now, I don't think that religion is only fear. I think that's kind of a modern aberration. But religion does have fear in it. People were afraid, and religion gives them a sense of control, a sense of comfort in very uncertain surroundings or settings. So if you think back to early people before historical records, and interestingly enough, if we look at culture, the earliest artifacts that we find tend to be, not in addition to tools, of course, that are basic for survival, but the earliest artifacts that we find that don't have anything to really do with simple survival are religious in orientation. So people realized that there's this kind of religious feeling early on. And I think that probably what was going on is that they realized how vulnerable they were, particularly in a day when they were still prey. I mean, keep in mind that we've only driven extinct our big predators and within the last few hundred years. Before that, people could be eaten by some kind of large cat or a bear or some other kind of predator. And so the fear was there. And one thing that you can do about fear is try to invoke a higher power. And I think that is what happens quite often in religions as they develop, is they look for somebody who is able to help them in their difficult times. I think horror does a similar sort of thing. It becomes a way of dealing with the the uncertainties of life. And for my own self, I use it as a kind of therapeutic way. So when I'm feeling overwhelmed by things, a lot of people will, maybe turn to some religious text, or try to find something funny or whatever. But for me, what really works is to watch horror, because it kind of validates that fear and says this is okay. It's all right to be afraid, and it's all right to overcome that fear, because most horror movies have some kind of resolution at the end that allows you to feel good about what happened in some way or another. You may feel completely victimized by it, but you still feel in a way that you've kind of reached a sort of catharsis. And I think that when that happens, it's functioning very much like a religion functions. And so I think that overlap in function between the two is really kind of what brings the two together, at least in my way of thinking.
Yeah, well, a little backstory. Theophantastique was birthed out of my reflections in seminary, taking a course on different religions, and we were discussing paganism. And it dawned on me during that time how much fantasy literature and so on was significant to many pagans. And I have found over the years that horror in particular, but also fantasy and science fiction, are amazing genres which facilitate religious conversations and religious understanding. So I really think that your discussion on that is very important and relevant. Anything else you want folks to be aware of or to look for in your book, Steve?
Not really. I mean, I'd just say give it a chance. I mean, it's a little bit unusual. There are other books out there on the Wicker Man. Interestingly enough, not a whole lot. And one of the frustrations I had working on the book was that you find these books about the Wicker Man that are simply not available anywhere.
Hmm.
So they exist, but one of them I think had I looked on WorldCat, and it was listed as being only in 14 libraries worldwide, none
Wow.
of them closer than about 1,000 miles from where I live. And so there's no possibility of even looking at it.
Hmm.
Um, I would say there's also another book on the Wicker Man coming out, I think in October, because somebody else noticed it was the 50th anniversary, and that one will be a bit more popular than mine, I'm sure. But the idea was that there wasn't a whole lot out there that gave people too much substance to discuss with the Wicker Man, other than an article here or there. There just wasn't anything book length that dealt with it, that really had any great substance to it. A lot of books about how the movie was made, or the message of the movie, but nothing that really kind of interacted with it on any kind of intellectual depth. And that's what I'm trying to do here. And it's a bit experimental, but I hope it's fun to read. It seems it was written for uh, general readers. You don't have to know anything about uh, film studies or theological studies, nothing like that. You can just be anybody off the street. But I would recommend, if you decide to read it, please watch the movie first if you haven't seen it. That's the most important thing, is see the movie so you know what I'm talking about.
Well, I'm sure it's a great read. I haven't had an opportunity yet, but I look forward to it. I enjoy all the work that you do, and I love having you come here to Theophantastique to discuss it. And you have an open invitation anytime, Steve. Thank you so much for coming here, and we look forward to the next time you come back.